Our session today is Get Smart on Efficient and Healthy Schools from Research to Practice. And I'm joined by two experts in this field. Let me welcome Anisa Heming, Director of the Center for Green Schools at the U.S. Green Building Council, and Dr. Rengie Chan, Research Scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Ladies, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start with some introductions before we get rolling. And I want to start with you, Anisa. Can you tell us a little bit about USGBC Center for Green Schools and your mission around sustainable schools?
Yes, I can definitely do that. So the first thing to know is that the Center for Green Schools is part of the U.S. Green Building Council, and USGBC, for anybody that doesn't know, who might be listening, is a nonprofit that is dedicated to making sure that the way that our communities and buildings are built and operated is promotes the health of the planet and the health of people. And so, we're best known for the development of the LEED rating system for buildings. And the Center for Green Schools was founded about 11 years ago to address specifically how we make sure that K through 12 schools are built and operated in that same way. And there are different things that affect how schools are built and operated than, say, a commercial building or a residential building. And so the idea behind the Center for Green Schools was to sort of target specifically the things that we needed to change and the way that we could kind of nudge the K through 12 sector towards sustainability. And so for us, sustainability in schools is defined by results with an eye toward environmental impact, health and wellness impact, and impact on sustainability, sustainable literacy, and literacy around the environment. And so it has to be sort of all three of those things that are present, and all three of those sort of results that define a green school.
That's terrific, Anisa, and we'll kind of unpack that in a little bit more in a moment. Rengie, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and your affiliation with the Department of Energy and University of California.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And the Berkeley Lab is one of the national laboratories supported by the U.S. Department of Energy. We are managed by the University of California. Physically, we're located in the hills about UC Berkeley, which is where I got my Ph.D. in environmental engineering. My background is in indoor air quality. I'm in a group called the Indoor Environment Group. So we do research studying energy use, occupant health in buildings. We do use tools like computer simulation. We do field study, lab study, and try to understand the interconnection between energy use, occupancy, and how a buildings influence these factors.
So it's really helpful I think it's a great level set. And again, so great to have both of you here. And Anisa, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how does the Center for Green Schools support students in preparation for 21st century careers. We've been talking a lot about this in this podcast series, and I'd love to get your point of view on that.
Yeah. So we really focus our work on the people at the school systems who can best affect change within their own systems. So we have a firm belief that there are people who care a lot about sustainability and climate action and topics around environmental health, and they're operating within school systems around the country, and they know their systems best. They know, who makes the decisions, how change happens, how to affect change within those systems. And so we do a lot to resource those people within school districts. So we provide peer-to-peer networking for them, opportunities to learn from each other, professional development, that kind of thing. And we also lift their voices up into national policy conversations and advocacy. And on green careers preparation in particular, we have seen a lot of great action within the CTE, the Career and Technical Education, around the country, and trying to orient that education toward green careers. We also have seen a lot of really interesting progress on incorporating sustainability across the board in K through 12 education. So trying to introduce sustainability concepts as a lens through which you can see all the other subjects that a student might be learning, right? Math and science, but also social studies, geography, literature, all of that. So we do have a sustainability curriculum platform called Learning Lab that teachers can access, and that collects content from over a dozen partner organizations who all put information and, in particular, classroom content that teachers can use onto that platform so that teachers can access and find stuff that aligns with standards and they can put into their classroom plans.
And that's a great, I think, pivot to thinking about, I will just say as a parent, actually, we're all parents here on this. I have to say, prior to the pandemic, Rengie, I didn't think that much about my child's in the indoor air quality of the school. Frankly, I thought if both of my children had a nice place to sit and I think it was well lit and comfortable, I really didn't think beyond that. And so your research with the lab is centered around indoor environments. And I'm curious how a school balances energy use, sustainability, and occupant comfort, right? Most of us as parents think maybe about the occupant, meaning our child, but we may not think about sustainability and energy use. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. A school has so many priorities that need to jiggle and so many stakeholders. And so this question makes sense. That how do they do it all? How do they balance sustainability, energy use, and comfort and health and occupant health? So I think we go back to the basic. We build schools to provide a space to learn and teach. So I think people have to come first. We have to make the place that is comfortable and healthy for the occupants, for our students, for our teachers, our staffs. So you can imagine the school that try to save a bit of energy and closed off the outside air dampers so they don't have ventilation. That's not really a success. So I think that, and if a school is providing a good indoor environmental quality, but right now using a little bit more energy than we hope it can, compared to its peer, that's an opportunity that we can act on. So I think definitely think about your occupants' comfort and health. And then we'll think about the technologies and approaches that we can use to lower our energy, lower our impact on the environment.
I'm curious, in the last couple of years, have you seen more innovations in terms of technologies that can be used for helping to manage indoor air quality, energy usage for schools?
I'll talk about the indoor air quality sides. There's definitely in the past few years a lot of monitors that are coming on board that are relatively low cost, that a school facing with question about, do I have adequate ventilation? Maybe during wildfires, how's my indoor air quality, can now purchase these relatively low cost indoor air quality monitors and get a better sense of how the environment is doing, instead of just guessing, like you're saying that you really don't know without measurement. So I think that is definitely an advance that's come about.
Well, and in a moment we'll circle back to how schools can even fund themselves for some of this, for some of these innovations. But back in April of this year, you partnered with ASHRAE, and the Center for Green Schools published a very informative white paper called Preparation in a Pandemic, based on survey results from school districts across the U.S. And so I wonder if you can elaborate on what you learned from that research.
Yeah, we noticed that there were a lot of recommendations coming down to school districts about what to do related to air quality. So, ASHRAE had some, the CDC had put together some, EPA. So we had seen all these recommendations coming, and we were doing some work to try to help school districts sort of understand those recommendations. But we realized that nobody was actually looking yet at what had actually been implemented and what could be implemented, what school districts sort of felt equipped to do. And so we decided to ask our network of school districts and join with ASHRAE to reach out further through their networks as well. And we focused in on 6 core recommendations from ASHRAE, and decided to ask about these recommendations that are well agreed upon, that have to do with bringing in fresh air, increasing filtration, and doing that in a couple different ways, through mechanical systems or through sort of natural ventilation systems, and try to see what had actually been going on in the field. And we were surprised by the findings. I mean, we found that school districts largely are relying on their mechanical systems. They're not trying to rely on some of these more natural systems, like opening windows, using exhaust fans, like that sort of thing. Very heavy reliance on mechanical systems. And a lot of that is driven by temperature, obviously temperature and humidity of outdoors, but also outdoor air quality. We had a lot of wildfires last year, just like this year. And, you can't bring in outdoor air directly if you're dealing with wildfire smoke. So the heavy reliance on mechanical systems. And then simultaneously, we asked them about challenges that they saw. And we heard across the board that one of the most prominently cited challenges was that their school buildings were not designed to implement the recommendations. So, heavy reliance on mechanical systems, but a lot of these mechanical systems are not designed to do what they're being asked to do. If you have radiators for heat in your classroom, that has nothing to do with bringing in outdoor air, and you might not have any other mechanical way to bring in outdoor air. So we heard loud and clear from those districts that, they really didn't feel prepared because their buildings weren't sort of set up for the kind of recommendations that they were getting.
I'm wondering, have you been able to recommend alternatives for those schools? Or has it been an issue where it's just these are important recommendations, but on the whole, they're difficult for those schools that have older buildings, or maybe schools that just don't have the equipment to upfit or retrofit? Just thoughts on that. What can those schools do when they're faced with that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that we know a lot about these sort of core strategies of bringing in outdoor air and filtering the air. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. So Boston Public Schools did some monitoring of their classroom air with various scenarios of opening windows, and they were able to actually get a pretty good air exchange rate just opening the windows like a little bit. So, this monitoring technology that Rengie was talking about earlier is actually incredibly helpful right now, because you can actually test out some strategies within classrooms and try to find some stuff that works. There's also pretty good technology for air cleaning, air scrubbing, different names for that, but basically, filtration systems that can be brought into classrooms, either standalone or they can be put in the ceilings to filter the air with HEPA filters or high grade, high efficiency filters. So those kinds of strategies are definitely ones that we recommend. Again, sort of focusing on those core, well-proven strategies that we know can remove the kind of particulate matter that includes the virus or that contains the virus.
So, Rengie, I want to dive down into this a little bit more deeply. So, kind of along the same lines as it relates to schools, what are some of the effects you have seen on students and teachers in schools that have and have not addressed their indoor air quality and indoor environments?
Yeah, that's a great question. My group has been studying the effect and impact on ventilation and indoor air quality on occupants' health for a long time. I think back in 2017, Bill Fisk was leading the group, my group, and he published a paper called The Ventilation Problem in Schools as a literature review. And there we look at the relationship between ventilation rates and student performance, health symptoms. So often we ask students or teachers to fill out a health survey. So do you experience any symptoms when you're at school? And also the relationship between ventilation rate and illness absence. So do we see in schools that are underventilated, we see higher illness absence? So in all across the board, we see some indication that these things are correlated. When you have an underventilated schools, your students going to not be learning as well. They're going to be experiencing health symptoms, and in some cases may lead to more illness absence. And I think the Harvard Schools for Health report is also an excellent resource that look more broadly at other aspects of indoor environmental quality. So lighting, thermal comfort, noise, and how do those impact student health? So that's definitely a good body of literature out there that show there's these correlations between schools that has poor indoor environmental quality and the impacts on the student.
Anisa, I would invite you to jump in on this question as well. Thoughts on school districts that are sort of leading the way in terms of best practice. If you don't want to name a specific school district, I'd love for you to maybe elaborate on the characteristics of those school districts, the ones that are doing this particularly well.
I think some states pay a lot of attention to setting a good building code, so at least school have something to look to. So in my great state of California, we have a really good building code. So at least we put every school on this common ground that if you are retrofitting your schools, if you're building a new school, make sure that you're meeting those standards. And if you want to get one step above that, there are organizations such as Lead School that have even,
Sure.
beyond and above. But so you can at least lift the bottom. And if you want to be the champion, go for the higher standards. So that's where I'll say.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point, Rengie, that I wasn't going to go to. There are a few states that have green building requirements for their schools that are being built. So there's the code, and then there's also sort of on top of that, either incentives like financial incentives or requirements for green construction for schools. So there's that. And then there's also states, some states are bigger contributors than others from the state coffers for school construction. And there we find more investment in school facility construction and renovations. And so the conclusion would be then that those schools are probably in better condition because there's more investment in the school building. But there are a couple of districts that are doing a really good job at monitoring and making that data about air quality accessible, which is amazing, and something that a lot of districts are nervous to do, especially if they don't have funding to fix problems. And so if you're not measuring, you can't fix anything. So that's a really key point. And then there are a couple of districts that are starting to do some kind of health planning across districts. And we're encouraging this actually through a new pilot credit in LEAD for health promotion process. So actually trying to get, especially in a school district where you have health professionals, like you have school nurses and you have, sometimes public health folks and social workers and other people with insights into sort of population health within a school district. And you actually bring them together to try to target design solutions within school building design and school building operation to target, some of the health issues that you might be seeing in a community.
I think that's so exciting. And I want to ask you another follow-up question, Anisa, maybe back to the report. This makes me think about the report and the preparation of the pandemic. I know there's a follow-up to that report. And so I wonder if you if you can just talk a little bit about what's in that follow-up, what insights can you or will, maybe top line, will you be sharing?
We're collecting new information from school districts across the country, and Rengie can talk about it as well, but there's a increased focus on the challenges that school districts have faced, trying to get a little bit more specific about those challenges. And there's also a focus on the use of the COVID relief funding or other funding sources that school districts might be pulling on to address some of these air quality challenges. And because that's new since our last report. There was some money, but the American Rescue Plan that was passed in March 2021 wasn't out when we released the last report, and so that's a huge resource for schools that they can pull on, and we're very interested in knowing if they have pulled on it for facilities work, because facilities is just one of many allowable uses of that funding, and so we're trying to sort of sort out what's been used.
Well, I'd love to just pull on two threads that you've shared, Anisa and Rengie. Talk a little bit about this. One is around the challenges. What challenges are administrators seeing right now? So I'd love to talk a little bit about that, and then talk about the funding solution, because we've talked about a number of innovations that are available. However, they cost money, and many school districts are quite strapped, although there looks like there's some opportunity at the federal level. So Rengie, maybe starting with some of the challenges that administrators are seeing. Anisa, for sure, please feel free to jump in on that.
I think one of the challenges, we probably have a long list of things to do. So how do you pick and choose? You have different school, each school have different problem. And I think the Department of Education have given pretty good guidance on the list of things that you can use the ESSER funds to support. So that's good. But that's still a long list. And each school is going to have to make their own decision of how much to spend on all these ventilation, filtration, other building control types investment compared to other priorities as the school have. But if we look more narrowly within the ventilation, filtration, building controls, I would suggest schools start with the most vulnerable. So those are the classrooms that do not have any ventilation right now. So you got to do something. You got to either put in some filtration, and Anisa talk about like different options you can think about. But those are the classrooms that need the most. And if you have classrooms that already have HVAC system, then I would start with some assessment of all of them. Make sure that there is, in fact, adequate airflow. And also install CO2 sensor might be another options for you to think about if you don't quite at the point of making retrofits, replacements. Those are very capital heavy projects. And then that comes to thinking about if you in fact have the capacity, the manpower, the money to do a retrofit. Can you push yourself a little bit more and avoid a like-to-like kind of replacement? Can you aim for higher efficiency? Is it a point in time where you get creative and you pull in a little bit more funding so you can do a little bit more than just replacing the same thing with the same thing? So getting more energy efficiency out of the new system that you're putting in. So I think those are some things that school can think about. And again, every school is a little different, so they do need to make their own decision in the end.
Anisa, I want to ask you, really this is again along the lines of funding. The Center for Green Schools published the 5 guiding principles, how districts can use COVID relief funds to advance healthy green schools. That came out this spring. And so my question for you is, what approach should school leaders take to make sure they are making the right decisions around the funds? And I think Rengie sort of talked on an aspect of it, but what other advice would you have for school administrators?
As Rengie was talking, I was thinking about the dynamic that exists with school decision makers, which is a little bit complex around the COVID relief funding. The COVID relief funding, the ESSER funding is coming through the Department of Education, and the federal government has almost never given money for school buildings and school facilities. So typically that money and the people who are used to administering those grants and is sort of figuring out how to stay in the lines for federal grants, like they're not used at school districts, they're not used to thinking about facilities. And so there's a little bit of a gap in knowledge there, but also a comfort level gap that we're noticing, that a lot of the folks who are planning for the use of the money or you submitting the paperwork around the money, they're just like not used to doing stuff related to facilities, because Department of Education dollars don't usually go to facilities, right? So there's a knowledge gap there. There's also the top level school district decision makers have almost always come up through the academic side of the house. So superintendent is probably like a former principal or something along those lines. School board members often get involved because they care about education and the educational program of the schools. And so there's also not just a gap in knowledge, but also kind of a tendency to overlook facilities by top level decision makers. So what we're noticing is that, COVID relief funding is construction and renovation and facilities work is absolutely allowable within this funding. The Department of Education has been very clear about that. But our facilities, the people in our network related to facilities are not always being brought to the table for decision making around that. So that there's a need for communities to advocate to their school decision makers that this is something they care about. There's also a need for our facilities staff around the country to be a little bit more vocal about what they need. I would encourage, so sort of those are the challenges. And then when it comes to actually using the money, I think the real opportunity here is on the assessment side that Rengie was talking about. We rarely have the opportunity for school districts to spend some money to like figure out what actually needs to be done for school buildings. There's, lots of putting out fires and, just fixing things that break and yada, yada. This is an opportunity to use some of this money to hire a firm or, spend some time with your own staff, like actually looking at what the status is of each building, what the systems within that building are yielding related to air quality. So actually doing some space measurement of air quality, trying to figure out, what should be planned for the future for this air quality work. And I would say there's an additional opportunity that's kind of dangling out there, which is that there are many of us who have been advocating on the federal level for additional funding specifically for school facilities, especially for low-income districts and sort of most neediest districts when it comes to their facilities. And there's a lot of traction on Capitol Hill for that, especially within the reconciliation package. If that funding is coming down the pike, that is a huge opportunity and it will need to be taken advantage of quickly by districts. And so using some of this COVID relief funding to understand the status of buildings is going to be really important to being able to act quickly with additional resources and be able to actually take advantage of some of those resources quickly.
Rengie, you're nodding your head. What would you add to that?
Oh, I was just thinking that if the facility manager are able to get to the table and bring these issues, if somehow your school district thinks that you already have a good handle on COVID, like why are we spending more on infrastructure? Think about all the challenges that your school are now facing because of wildfires, because of extreme heat, because of extreme weather. I think about if those are the issues that may be motivating to your school district and bring those in too, because it is a once in a lifetime opportunity to finally make some long-term investment in your buildings that will affect your schools for a very, very long time.
Anisa, what else would you add to that?
Absolutely. Plus, agree. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of conversation among school decision makers, especially with the COVID relief funding that there are not, that it's a little bit nerve wracking to have this like one-time funding.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, and you can't do things that are going to need additional funding, like staff is very like, people don't want to hire staff with this COVID relief funding because they won't have funding to keep them on, right? So there's a lot of like hiring temps and doing temporary programs, and like it feels very hard for school districts to figure out exactly how to use this one-time funding. Facilities is like a great use of one-time funding because you can invest in things that, as Rengie was saying, are going to set you up for, just better results over time, like some hardening against some natural risks, some energy efficiency results, like that you can save money over time if you invest really wisely in some efficiency, some equipment that's going to give you more efficiency with resources. So it's a great opportunity to kind of invest the money, one-time money, and then try to realize gain over time that you can maybe put toward some of these other things like instructional technology and staff. So it's like a pretty perfect fit for facilities work, actually.
Both have talked about not only the opportunity, but Rengie, you talked about, for example, the need to prioritize. School districts have so very many needs. If a superintendent is listening to this and they know they've got funding available through their local Department of Education at their state, but where should they start to really ramp up quickly in terms of what their knowledge about what they can be doing and how to help them make better decisions?
Yes. So Anisa mentioned that Department of Education is very focused on the education aspect of it. And that's really a need for the cross-agency collaboration. So happy to announce that there is the Efficient and Healthy Schools campaign that we are leading, the Berkeley Lab is leading. It's a project it's an effort funded by the U.S. Department of Energy with collaborating partners from US EPA and Department of Education. So if schools have questions, please join our campaign. We're all happy to talk to you directly, offer some direct technical assistance. And beyond that, one more point is EPA has been working on IAQ for schools for a very, very long time. They have a tremendous amount of resources if you're thinking about how do I make energy efficiency and health work together. They have the Energy Saving Plus Health Report. They also have the IAQ tool for schools, like great toolkits, whether you are in the planning phase, the execution phase, think about what kind of retrofit makes the most sense, or in the more want to make operation and maintenance improvements. They have all that covers.
Oh, outstanding. And we will be sure to link to those too in our show notes. Anisa, what would you add to that?
I would add ASHRAE as a great resource. They're very careful with what they put out in terms of air quality recommendations for schools. So I would definitely give that as a place to go. On the sort of what not to do side of the fence would be, please do not rely on a single supplier to get all of your information. We're seeing a lot of misinformation in the field about various technologies. So, do your homework and reach out to, my organization, ASHRAE, some of the agencies, and get some feedback about some things that you're hearing in the field. Everyone is very intent on making sure that schools have the information they need to make really good decisions. And, all of the people that work in this space are really eager to help schools out in making good decisions. So don't hesitate. We released, as you mentioned earlier, Portia, a guidance document called the 5 Guiding Principles about COVID relief funding and what can be done with that. And so that includes allowable uses. It includes some questions to ask of your school decision makers. It includes lists of resources in various topics. So it's a good sort of collection of things to think about related to COVID relief funding as your district is planning for the use of that funding. And then we also have some educational courses that the center has done with leaning heavily on the community of green building professionals that USGBC collects and convenes. And so we've released a lot of that, and that's all free education on the center's website. You can find our online courses there. So that would be another resource to use.
Well, Dr. Rengie Chan, Anisa Heming, what a wonderful and I think thought-provoking conversation. And the resources that you've provided as well, I think are going to be invaluable to our listeners. I'd love to ask you, Rengie, any final thoughts you would like to leave our listeners? You first.
I am very excited to see what's going to happen with all this ESSER fund and all those great changes that's going to happen to schools. I think that's an opportunity to study in school district and states that heavily invested in infrastructure. As a result of this, do we see good outcomes from these school districts? So as a researcher, I'm seeing a research study coming up.
Oh, wonderful. And Anisa, any final thoughts from you for our listeners?
Yeah, I think along the lines of opportunity, like Rengie was saying, I mean, we rarely have the kind of attention that is currently being paid to our indoor environments at schools. I've never seen it in my 15 years in this field, and it's an opportunity that I hope we can maximize to try to improve some of these indoor environments. We've been raising alarm bells for years about the fact that air quality in schools is not up to the standard it should be, to keep kids alert and help them, be ready to learn and keep them healthy. And this is an opportunity to do some of that work. And I am eager to make the most of it. And I think we can, because we have the technology and the knowledge to do what needs to be done. It's just a matter of sort of flexing that public will and making sure that, the attention stays on the topic.
Well, very well said. And thank you to you both for a very enlightening conversation today.
Thanks for having us, Portia.